Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in history. In the Appalachian Mountains, where thick fog hides old secrets, there is a story that makes no sense at all, a story that has been passed down through the years and is still shrouded in mystery, only spoken of by those who are brave enough to remember. This video is a work of fiction made only for fun. Any similarities to real people, living or dead, are purely coincidental. In 1904, the Appalachian Mountains were like a natural wall between the civilized world and the still unexplored parts of the American interior. At that time, traveling through those heights meant dealing with narrow trails, dangerous cliffs, and the complete lack of people that only mountains can bring. There weren't many people in each community, and they lived in deep valleys. Messengers had to risk their lives to get between them, and their trips could last for days. People in Wise County, Virginia, knew Thomas McAllister very well. He worked as a surveyor for companies that wanted to map the mountainous areas. This job required bravery and a deep understanding of those dangerous paths. People who hired Thomas felt safe with him because he was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a piercing gaze. Some people in the area, though, didn't like something about him. Maybe it was how quietly he walked through the woods, or how he seemed to know every stone and tree, as if the mountains were telling him secrets that no one else could hear. That year, during a very cold winter, a number of strange things started to happen that disturbed the peace of the small villages on the hillsides. People who traveled along the old trade routes said they felt strange things, like being watched, hearing footsteps behind them even when they stopped to listen, and seeing recent marks in the snow that didn't look like human or known animal footprints. The elders talked quietly about old legends, stories that went back to the time when the first settlers had to deal with not only a hostile environment, but also something darker that lived in those heights. No one knew these stories better than Thomas. He kept a detailed diary during his trips where he wrote down not only measurements and coordinates, but also strange things he saw, like clearings where plants grew in perfect circles, caves whose depths he had never been able to fully explore, and ruins of buildings that didn't seem to be built by either natives or colonists. These notes, which were found decades later in a trunk that had been forgotten, showed that a man was obsessed with solving mysteries that most people would rather not think about. That year, everything changed in March. Thomas got a strange offer to map out a certain part of the mountains that people in the area stayed away from, and that had some scary rumors going around about it. The company that hired him paid him a lot of money, more than he would have made in months of regular work. He was tempted by the money, but there was something else that drove him. He wrote in his diary about meeting an old mountaineer weeks before. The man had told him about impossible discoveries in that area that was off-limits. Thomas stopped by the local tavern where he usually met other mountain workers before he left. Witnesses said that night that he seemed different and more upset than usual. He said that he finally had the chance to prove that the stories were true and that there were hidden truths in those hills that would change everything that was known about the area. Some people laughed, while others looked away in discomfort. But one man told him not to go. He said that place used to be called the Valley of Silence, and even the birds wouldn't sing there. The next day, Thomas left at dawn with his measuring tools, food for 2 weeks, and the diary that would be found much later. He took the Black Cliff Path, a winding trail that went between deep ravines. A woodcutter who worked near the start of the trail was the last person to see him alive. Thomas stopped for a moment, looked back as if to remember the view of the valley below, and then disappeared into the trees covered in moss. Weeks passed, and Thomas still hadn't come back. People weren't worried right away when he didn't show up, since long trips were common in his line of work. But when a month went by without any news, people became very worried. The company that hired him put together a search team made up of experienced hunters and men who had lived in the mountains since they were kids. They followed the same path Thomas had taken, going deeper and deeper into the wilderness. What they found in the first few days was troubling. Thomas's camp was still there in a clearing. His food and tools were still in order, but the man was gone. There were no signs of a fight, an animal attack, or a violent confrontation. It was as if he had just gotten up and walked into nothingness, leaving everything behind. The diary, which was open on a flat stone and had its last entry a week after he left, was even more disturbing. The last thing Thomas wrote in his diary made the search team feel sick. He talked about finding something amazing, structures that didn't make sense according to any known logic, arranged in ways that suggested intelligence and purpose. He said he heard sounds coming from deep inside the earth, as if the mountain itself were breathing. And then, on the last line, he wrote, "They knew I would come. Now I see what has always been here." The searchers spent days looking at every part of that area. They followed paths that led nowhere and saw marks on trees that looked like they were made by tools but didn't match any known tool. In 1904, there weren't many ways to investigate. So those men had to rely on their gut feelings and what they had learned from experience. The lack of noise in that area was what bothered them the most. There were no animal sounds, no bird songs, just the wind whispering through the old trees. One of the searchers, who had been on many trips through the Appalachians before, swore he saw something that made him doubt his own sanity. While the group slept near Thomas's old camp at night, he woke up feeling like someone was watching him. He looked into the dark forest and saw what he called shadows moving in a strange way, gliding between the trees without making a sound. When he told the others the next morning, some laughed nervously, but others said they had felt something like that too. After 3 weeks, the search was officially called off. Authorities in Wise County said Thomas McAllister was missing, likely because he had an accident in the dangerous mountains. His family, who lived in a bigger town to the east, got his things, including the disturbing diary, but that wasn't the end of the story. Over the next few months, more strange things happened in the area. People who traveled through the area near the Valley of Silence said they had strange things happen to them. Some people said they saw a lone figure watching from a high place, but it was always too far away to be clearly identified. When they tried to get closer, it vanished. Some people said they found Thomas's personal things in places that were impossible, like miles away from where his camp had been found. No one knew how these things had gotten there. In June of that year, a shepherd leading his flock down a different path found something that brought the whole investigation back to life. He found what looked like a temporary shelter in a hidden ravine that was protected by a natural rock formation. There were signs of a recent campfire, leftover food, and most interestingly, symbols carved into the stones around the area. The symbols didn't match any of the native languages of the area, and they didn't look like they were made by European colonists either. They were complicated geometric shapes that were woven together in a way that made them look like they were moving. The authorities were told, and a new trip was planned. This time, they hired a Georgetown University scholar who was interested in archaeology and ancient cultures. The man was very interested in the symbols, which could be hundreds or even thousands of years old. But something bothered him. Some of the symbols looked like they had just been redone, as if someone was keeping them visible to protect them from the effects of time. It got even more confusing when these symbols were compared to drawings that were found in Thomas's diary. He had drawn similar patterns in his last few entries and talked about what they might mean. Thomas thought that those symbols were some kind of map or warning left by people who lived in the mountains long before the colonists came. He had written about a theory that seemed crazy, that some parts of the Appalachians held secrets that should never be revealed. The oldest people in the area started telling stories that their families had kept to themselves for years. They talked about a time when their ancestors first came to those lands and made unwritten deals about places that should never be explored. They talked about people who had gone missing decades before, who had crossed these invisible lines. Thomas was not the first person to die in those mountains. He was just the most recent in a long line of people who have. The search for answers got less intense as summer went by. Life in the small mountain towns went back to normal, but the case of Thomas McAllister had a lasting effect. People told his story in taverns, whispered it on stormy nights, and used it as a warning to those who thought about going to the most remote areas. And even though the world went on, something in the mountains seemed to wake up. The Appalachian Mountains changed color in the fall, turning the slopes red and gold. It was a time of strange beauty, when shadows grew longer earlier and mist rose from the valleys like ghostly fingers. In October 1904, even more disturbing news started to come out of towns near the Valley of Silence. A merchant who traveled regularly between the mountain villages brought bad news. He talked about people who had started having the same dreams over and over again. In these dreams, a man was always walking through the mountains looking for something he could never find. What was most disturbing was that people who had never met and lived in communities miles apart in rough terrain described the same person in the same places. Some people said they knew Thomas McAllister in those dreams. Thomas's wife, who had stayed in Lynchburg to wait for news, chose to make the long trip to the mountains. She brought with her letters from her husband that he had sent in the weeks before he went missing. These letters showed that he was getting more and more upset. Thomas said in them that he had found references to old county documents that talked about previous trips to that area that ended in tragedy or mystery. He thought he was getting close to figuring out a pattern that linked all of those events over the years. While she was in the mountains, the woman insisted on going to the place where her husband's campsite had been found. She made the long, hard trip to the clearing with the help of 2 experienced guides. What happened there was never fully explained, but the guides said that she stayed quiet for a long time, looking at the landscape around her as if she could hear something that only she could hear. When she finally spoke, her words were strange. "He is not lost. He chose to stay." The guides tried to figure out what she meant, but she wouldn't say anything more. She picked up some stones from the area, some dirt from where Thomas's tent had been set up, and asked to go back. Before she left for Lynchburg, she spent a lot of time talking to the oldest people in the area. She asked them about local legends and the history of the mountains before settlers came. The things she learned from these talks changed her in a big way. She became quieter and more thoughtful. In the meantime, the Georgetown scholar who had looked at the symbols in the ravine came back with better tools and an assistant. They spent weeks writing down not just the symbols, but also the strange geological features of the area. They found out that this area had strange magnetic properties that made compasses spin wildly and made strange patterns in their measuring tools. There were also rock formations that looked like they had been put together on purpose, but it was impossible to tell when this happened with the tools they had at the time. The scholar's assistant, a young person who was interested in strange events, started putting together all the reports of disappearances and strange things that had happened in the Appalachians over the past 100 years. He found a disturbing pattern. About every 10 years, someone went missing in that area, always in the same way. People who went into the Valley of Silence looking for something, whether out of curiosity or the promise of finding something valuable, simply disappeared, leaving behind only their belongings and unanswered questions. The Wise County archives, which were kept in a damp basement of the local government building, showed even older documents. There were mentions of an unofficial deal made in 1820 between early settlers and a group of Native Americans who still lived in the mountains at the time. The agreement, which was never written down but was passed down orally from generation to generation, said that some areas should not be touched. The Native Americans would show the settlers safe paths and tell them about the area in exchange. Most people forgot about this deal over the years. New generations, not knowing why their ancestors had warned them, started to explore areas that had been off limits before. Thomas McAllister wasn't just a curious surveyor. He was the last of a long line of explorers who, whether they meant to or not, pushed the limits of what was known. And the mountains reacted in ways that were impossible to understand. An amazing thing happened in November, when winter started to show its sharp claws. Even though he had known those mountains since he was a child, a hunter chasing a deer through the woods got lost in an area he didn't know. While trying to reorient himself, he stumbled upon a sight that would mark him for the rest of his life. On a rocky elevation, perfectly framed against the gray twilight sky, stood a human figure. The distance was too great for clear details, but the posture, the way the figure held something that appeared to be a measuring instrument, all suggested Thomas McAllister. The hunter shouted, waved, tried to get closer, but the terrain between them was treacherous, full of crevices hidden beneath low vegetation. There was no one there when he finally found a way up the rocky hill. There were only marks on the ground, as if someone had stayed in that exact spot long enough to leave deep impressions in the earth. One of the symbols Thomas had drawn in his diary was carved into the nearest rock with a sharp tool and a steady hand. The hunter's tale spread through the mountain communities like wildfire. Some accused him of imagining it all, a product of exhaustion and the deceptive twilight. Others, however, believed every word, for he was not known for fantasies or exaggerations. He was a sober, respected man who had spent his entire life navigating those difficult terrains. If he said he had seen something, then he had seen it. The sheriff of Wise County, a pragmatic man who generally dismissed ghost stories and unexplained mysteries, decided to take an unusual approach. He organized an official expedition, documented in records that still exist in the region's historical archives. The goal was to fully map the Silent Valley area, establish landmarks, and if possible, find some logical explanation for the events that had accumulated over that difficult year. The trip began in December 1904, which was a dangerous time for mountain climbing. But the sheriff was adamant. They brought supplies for 3 weeks, camping gear that could handle the extreme cold, and detailed records of all the reports that had come in before. There were a Georgetown scholar who was completely absorbed in the mystery and 2 Civil War veterans who knew how to survive in the worst conditions better than anyone else. There were no problems in the first few days. They used the tools they had at the time to map out trails, record rock formations and caves, and set up landmarks. But on the 5th night, while camping on a hill that gave them a great view of the valley below, something happened that made everyone question their sanity. The watchman who kept the campfire going woke everyone else up around 3 a.m. He pointed to the valley where dozens of small lights moved in a way that looked like they were following an invisible dance. The light was different. It was lighter and almost blue, so they weren't torches or regular lanterns. The lights moved around the trees, climbed steep hills, and appeared and disappeared in different places without following a logical path. The event lasted for about 40 minutes. Everyone on the expedition saw it, and everyone wrote about it in their own diaries. The scientists tried to come up with scientific explanations for the gases coming from cracks in the rock, the glow of an unknown mineral, and the way crystals reflect light in the dampness of the night fog. But none of the explanations fully explained what he had seen. They went down to the place where the lights had been seen when dawn broke. The plants were disturbed, as if something heavy had walked through them, but there were no clear footprints. But there were more symbols carved into trees, and these were the same ones that had been found before. And in a certain clearing, they found something that made their skin crawl, a perfect circle where nothing grew, and the ground was packed down in a way that made it look like it had been used a lot. The oldest veteran, a man who had fought in wars without flinching, said he was really scared for the first time in decades. There was something very wrong with that place, something that tapped into basic survival instincts that civilization tries to keep down. He told them to leave right away, but the sheriff was set on finishing the job. Over the next few days, they broke into smaller groups so they could cover more ground. During one of these separations, the scholar's assistant found something that would change how everyone thought about the case. While exploring a cave that opened up in a vertical cliff, he found clear signs that people had lived there recently. There were still signs of campfires, places where someone had slept, and even some things that were clearly from the 1800s. But the most amazing thing was a series of writings on the walls of the cave. Someone had written messages in English with charcoal from the fire. The messages were broken up phrases that talked about watching, patterns that repeated themselves over time, and the need to see and write down what happened. The handwriting was hard to read because of the cave's conditions, but people who had read Thomas McAllister's diary knew it was his. He had been there, alive, weeks after he went missing. The messages didn't show sadness or cries for help. Instead, they showed determination and even interest. Thomas wrote that he had figured out something important, and that being there gave his life meaning. The last sentence that could be read said, "I am not a prisoner. I am a witness. Some of us need to stay so that others may understand when the time comes." The expedition members had a lot of arguments about what to do after finding the cave. The sheriff wanted to use it as proof that Thomas had lived at first and might still be alive somewhere in the mountains, possibly because he had a mental illness that made him avoid people. The scholar, on the other hand, saw something more complicated. A story that went beyond a man who was just lost in nature. They decided to leave food and a clear message in the cave that Thomas would be welcome back, that no one would judge him, and that his family was waiting for him. They carefully marked the spot on their maps and made plans to go back often to see if the supplies had been used. They did the best they could, given that the situation didn't follow any normal search and rescue rules. When the expedition finally got back to civilization, they had more questions than answers. People who were interested in strange events started passing around copies of their official reports, which were kept secret. The case of Thomas McAllister became something bigger, a window into the secrets that the Appalachian Mountains held long before Europeans arrived and would continue to hold long after everyone involved had passed away. The winter of 1905 hit the Appalachian Mountains hard, with blizzards that cut off some towns for weeks at a time. The trails were too hard to follow, and anyone who wanted to go back to the Valley of Silence would have to wait until spring. During these months of forced confinement, the stories about Thomas McAllister took on a life of their own, being retold around family hearths, evolving and transforming with each narration. A pastor of a small Methodist church near Bristol started collecting stories from his church members about strange things that happened to them in the mountains. He wasn't interested in the morbid because he was a pastor. Many people in his community were having nightmares, feeling uneasy, and sometimes even feeling the need to hike to the more remote mountain areas. The pastor did not see this as just a mental health issue. He thought it was something that needed to be looked into carefully. The pastor wrote down dozens of testimonies in his notes, which are kept in the county historical library. A woman in her 80s told the story of her late husband, an experienced hunter who had gone missing in the same mountains 30 years earlier. She had never talked about it in public before, but now she felt like she had to. Her husband had become obsessed with a certain part of the forest and kept going back to it, saying there was something there that needed to be understood. A merchant who often crossed the mountains to bring goods also told a story. He said that on some full moon nights you could hear sounds coming from deep in the valleys that weren't human or animal, but something in between. He said they were chants, or maybe laments that echoed between the peaks in a way that made it impossible to tell where they came from. His horses would get upset and refuse to move forward whenever they heard these sounds. He had learned to respect this animal instinct. The Georgetown scholar couldn't go back to the mountains in the winter, so he spent his time studying older historical records. He went to libraries in Richmond, looked through archives in Williamsburg, and even went to Charleston to look at colonial records. What he found was a pattern that went much deeper than he had thought at first. There were a few references to a part of the Appalachians that early settlers called hollow ground, but people disagreed on what that meant. There are records from 1750 that talk about a group of French explorers who supposedly found old buildings in that area that were built before any known European settlement. The stories were incomplete and often didn't agree with each other, but they all had some things in common: descriptions of symbols carved into stone, reports of glowing things at night, and warnings not to disturb what lived there. A French explorer wrote that the people who lived there were very afraid of that area and only went there on special occasions, always with protective rituals. At the same time, Thomas's wife in Lynchburg started getting letters from people she didn't know. The letters came at odd times, always without a name on them, and the handwriting was not something she recognized. The content was mysterious, talking about cycles that were finished, guardians who chose to stay, and how important it was not to interrupt processes that were too complicated for most people to understand. One of the letters had a very clear drawing of one of the symbols found in the mountains, along with the words, "He understands now and is at peace." She showed these letters to the sheriff, who started looking into where they came from. The stamps on the letters showed that they had come from different small villages in the mountainous area. It seemed impossible for one person to travel between all of these places during the harsh winter, unless there were several senders working together, or the letters had been dropped off at the local post offices well in advance. In March, when the snow began to melt and the trails became easier to follow, the sheriff set up a new expedition. This time, the group would be smaller and more focused. Just him, a trusted guide, and the scholar from Georgetown. The goal was to check the cave where Thomas's messages had been found and see if the supplies left there had been used. The trip was hard because the ground was slippery with mud and streams were too full of melting snow to use normal paths. It took them 6 days to get to the Valley of Silence area, which is twice as long as it usually does. When they finally got to the cave, they found something that none of them had planned for. The supplies were gone, but there were things that clearly belonged to Thomas McAllister: his compass, his pocket watch, and an extra notebook that no one knew he had. The notebook had detailed drawings of the mountains from angles that would be impossible to get to without climbing very dangerous peaks. There were also notes on the phases of the moon, the patterns of the stars, and complicated math that seemed to be trying to figure out some kind of timeline. It was even more scary to see a new message on the cave walls that had been written recently because the charcoal was still fresh. The note said, "Search no more. There is work here that cannot be explained. Tell those who love me that I have found my place in the great mystery. I am a sentinel now, as others were before me, and as others will be after." The sheriff was very upset by what he found. He was a cop who was used to getting clear answers and solving cases, but this time he was up against something that wouldn't fit into any category or solution. It was clear that Thomas McAllister was alive, or at least had been until very recently, but it was also clear that he did not want to be found or saved. The law and morals were both put to the test when it came to what to do next. The Georgetown scholar spent hours going through Thomas's notebook, taking pictures of each page with the simple technology of the time and carefully writing down each entry. The math showed that the person had not lost their mind, but was instead thinking about something that was completely outside of what most people could understand. It looked like Thomas was trying to find some kind of convergence, or specific times when certain conditions in the mountains lined up in certain ways. There were historical dates all over the place, and each one had a unique symbol next to it. The scholar discovered a troubling connection when he compared these dates to his own records of disappearances and strange events in the area. Each date marked by Thomas matched up with a documented event, such as a person going missing or an extraordinary experience. It was as if he had found a time pattern, a hidden rhythm that controlled the secrets of those mountains. The quiet man who was with them as a guide finally spoke up. He didn't often give his opinion without being asked. He said that his grandfather, who died a long time ago, was one of the last natives to live in those highlands for good before being forced to move to lower lands. His grandfather told him stories about the ancients, people who lived in the mountains long before Europeans did and knew things about the Earth's cycles that we don't know anymore. These stories say that the mountains sometimes called certain people to join something bigger. They chose to camp close to the cave for a few days to see if Thomas would get in touch with them. They set up shifts for people to watch so that someone was always awake and alert. Around midnight on the second night, the sheriff who was on duty saw something moving at the edge of the clearing. Someone was slowly walking toward me, carefully stepping between the trees. He was excited because he thought they would finally meet. But as the figure emerged from the darkness, the sheriff realized it wasn't Thomas McAllister. It was an older man, dressed in clothes worn by time and the elements, with a long beard and a piercing gaze. He approached the campfire fearlessly as if he had every right to be there. His voice was rough from not being used, but his words were clear and planned. The old man said his name was Ezekiel, though he admitted it had been so long since he'd used that name that he sometimes doubted whether he was still truly who he had been. He recounted that he had lived in the mountains for over 20 years, that he had initially come looking for gold, but had found something far more valuable: understanding. He knew Thomas, had spoken with him on multiple occasions, and brought a message that Thomas wanted to be conveyed. The message was both very simple and very deep. Thomas wanted his family to know that he was okay, that he had made a conscious choice, and that they shouldn't have to suffer because of him. He had found something in the mountains that needed people to see it and write about it for more than one lifetime. He was now part of a line of people who watched over knowledge that couldn't just be written down or passed on. It had to be experienced by being there all the time. The sheriff tried to argue with Thomas, to talk about his duties, his family, and the world he had left behind. Ezekiel listened carefully and then smiled sadly. He said that all sides had been heard and that the choice had not been made lightly. People who stayed in the mountains didn't do it because they were crazy or wanted to get away. They did it because they had a purpose that was hard to explain to people who hadn't felt the call. Ezekiel hesitated when the scholar asked about the symbols, the patterns, and what was really going on. Lastly, he said that the mountains remembered not only things that happened to people, but also things that happened long before that and were more important. There were places where the line between what we know and what we don't know got thinner, and it was possible to see truths that are usually hidden. The symbols were meant to show where these areas were and when and where these perceptions could happen. Ezekiel stayed with them until dawn, telling them stories about his life in the mountains and the people he had met over the years who had taken similar paths. He talked about how human exploration and keeping secrets should be in a delicate balance, and how civilization's progress was upsetting something that had been stable for hundreds of years. He got up and got ready to leave as the sun started to turn the sky pink and gold. Ezekiel gave the sheriff a sealed letter for Thomas's wife before he left. He told her that there were words inside that only she could really understand, and he hoped they would bring her some peace. Then, without any more fuss, he turned and disappeared into the trees, as quietly and easily as he had come. They tried to follow him, but it was like he disappeared into the forest, becoming part of it in a way that made it impossible to find him. The expedition came back to civilization with more artifacts and information, but also the burden of knowing that some mysteries will never be solved. The sheriff brought the letter to Thomas's wife herself and watched as she read it in private. Her eyes were red when she came out of the room, but her face showed that she was calm and accepting. She thanked the sheriff and said that now she understood. She could finally move on because she knew her husband had found something that gave him a reason to live. The county records showed that the case was officially closed and labeled as a voluntary disappearance. But for those who saw the evidence and heard the testimonies, it was clear that the story was much more complicated. Thomas McAllister had crossed a line, both in terms of where he was and in terms of who he was. On the other side, he had found something that made it worth staying. It was still up for debate and speculation whether this was insanity, enlightenment, or something else entirely. After the case was officially closed, the communities around the Valley of Silence changed in a small but very important way over the next few months. People started to look at the mountains with a mix of respect and curiosity, knowing that there was something beyond the trees and rocks that they couldn't fully understand. The Georgetown scholar wrote an academic paper about what he found, being careful not to make any claims that could hurt his reputation. However, it still sparked heated debates in intellectual circles. In the spring of 1905, there was an unusual number of visitors to the mountains. Reporters from big cities like Richmond and even Washington came with notebooks and old-fashioned cameras. They wanted to get something amazing on film, or at least talk to people who had seen the events that had been reported on in sensationalist newspapers. The locals, who were usually open to strangers, became cautious and reserved, keeping their stories and sacred places safe from what they thought were intrusive eyes. One of these journalists, a woman named Margaret Harrison, who wrote for a Boston newspaper, took a different approach. She didn't try to get attention. Instead, she lived with the mountain people for weeks, earning their trust through real respect and patience. She gathered stories that other people had missed, stories that were only told in private, late at night, when walls came down and deeper truths could come out. Margaret was especially interested in the stories of women from the area, which male researchers often didn't pay attention to. An old weaver talked about visions she had had since she was a child. They were pictures of people walking in the mountains at different times, as if she were seeing through time. She said she saw ancient natives, early settlers, and more recently, people dressed in clothes from the 1800s, all coming together in the same places, drawn by something she couldn't name but could feel. Another woman, a midwife who helped deliver babies in remote areas, shared a disturbing observation. She had noticed that kids born at certain times of the year, especially when they were born during times that matched the temporal patterns Thomas had found, were unusually sensitive to the mountains. These kids grew up with a strong connection to the land. They often talked about feeling or hearing things that other people didn't. Some of these kids chose to live in the most remote areas when they grew up. They became guides, hunters, or just hermits who liked being alone in the mountains more than being around other people. Margaret also spoke with the pastor who had put together the testimonies over the winter. He had come up with a complicated religious theory to explain how the things that happened in the mountains fit with his Christian beliefs. He didn't think of the guardians as heretics or crazy people, but as people who were answering a divine call of a different kind, like Ezekiel and Thomas had. He said they were like the Old Testament prophets who went to the desert, or the monks who sought enlightenment by being alone and thinking. Margaret had her own scary experience while she was doing research. While walking along a well-known trail near one of the villages with a local guide, she lost sight of her friend for a short time while she looked at an interesting rocky outcrop. She was alone for no more than 5 minutes, but in that short time, something happened that she would never be able to put into words. The air around her seemed to change, getting thicker and more colorful at the same time. She heard what she called music, but it wasn't a melody she could easily copy or describe. It sounded like it came from the earth itself, and for a brief moment she thought she saw clear figures moving through the trees. They weren't ghosts in the usual sense, but presences, as if different times were briefly overlapping. When her guide called her and she blinked, everything went back to normal. She wondered if it had really happened, or if it was just her overactive imagination. This event changed the way Margaret looked at the history she was studying. She went from being a skeptical person who was interested to someone who was really trying to figure out things that didn't fit with what she thought she knew. Over the course of several months, she wrote more articles that were very balanced, giving the facts without passing judgment so that readers could come to their own conclusions. At the same time, Thomas's wife made a surprising choice. She had moved into a small house near Abington, a mountain town that isn't too far from the Valley of Silence. She didn't try to find or visit her husband, probably because she was following an unspoken agreement made in the letter she got. However, she wanted to be close to him and keep a geographical connection with the place where he had chosen to stay. She set up a small salon in her home where people who wanted to hear about Thomas could come, but only if they showed her real respect. The Georgetown scholar was one of her regular visitors. They became close friends because they both loved the mysteries of the mountains. They worked together to put together a small library of documents, maps, and testimonies about the area's strange events. This archive would later be given to the local historical society. That summer, something happened that made people even more sure that the mountains had their own way of doing things. A group of geologists from the University of Virginia came to look into the minerals in the area. They were serious scientists who didn't believe the stories they had heard and were only interested in academic goals. But after just a week in the field, 3 of the 5 team members asked to go back right away. They wouldn't say anything more about what they had seen other than that the area was geologically unstable and could be dangerous. The 2 who stayed finished the planned study, but their reports included strange things they couldn't explain, like magnetic readings that changed a lot for no clear reason, rock samples that showed different properties when looked at in the lab, and seismic records that suggested underground activity that didn't fit with what we know about tectonic or volcanic activity. In a private letter to the Georgetown scholar, one of the geologists said that he felt like the Earth itself was aware of his presence and was subtly responding to his instruments and investigations. Ezekiel came back for a short time in August, this time to Thomas's wife's house. He had a small package wrapped in tanned deerskin that Thomas wished she had. It had his wedding ring, a family photo he had with him, and a medallion that had belonged to his mother. Ezekiel stayed just long enough to drop off the package and send a simple message. Thomas was fine, had fully adjusted to life in the mountains, and was grateful to her for understanding his choice. People in the academic community started to disagree about what happened in Appalachia. Some people thought it was all just mass hysteria caused by small groups of people who were superstitious and liked to make things bigger than they really were. Some people saw that the patterns were too consistent to be written off as fantasy. A Yale anthropologist suggested that the area may have been spiritually important to ancient cultures, and that their beliefs and practices left a psychic imprint that still affects people who are sensitive. The harvests that came in the fall brought with them traditional festivals in the mountain villages. For the first time in decades, the festivals openly talked about the region's ancient stories and mysteries, which were a big part of its identity. Elders who had kept quiet about some things before started to share knowledge that had been passed down through the years. They knew that if they didn't do it now, a lot would be lost when they were gone. In this new era of openness, people began to understand better what places like the Valley of Silence meant. They weren't just dangerous or mysterious places to stay away from. They were an important part of what connected people to that land. The guardians, like Thomas and Ezekiel, were not tragic people who had gone crazy. They were people doing a job that most people couldn't understand, but that had its own value and meaning. The winter of 1906 was less harsh than the one before it, which made the trails easier to get to for longer periods of time. This led to something unexpected: a steady stream of people looking for their own answers about the mountains, each with their own reasons. Some people came out of scientific curiosity, some out of a desire to find God, and some just felt drawn to the mountains, as if something there called them by name. Robert Chen, a painter from Philadelphia, whose ancestors came to the U.S. as Chinese immigrants and worked on the railroads, was one of these visitors. He came to the area to paint the wild beauty of the Appalachians, but he quickly realized that he was painting something much deeper. His paintings started to show not only the physical landscape, but also the mood that filled those places. For example, the shadows that seemed to have more depth than they should, and the lights that hinted at a presence beyond what could be seen. Robert set up a temporary studio in an old cabin near the village of Lebanon. It was in a good spot to see the heights where the Valley of Silence was hidden. He worked on his paintings outside all day, and over time he started to notice patterns in how the light changed, and how some places seemed to pulse with energy at certain times. He started writing down these observations in a separate journal, making a visual record of things that other people had only talked about. Robert saw something that left him speechless one February afternoon while he was painting at dusk. A lone figure stood on a rocky peak in the distance, silhouetted against the darkening sky. There was something about the figure's posture that made it look like it was deep in thought, even from a long way away. It was still, which was different from the wildness all around it. Robert quickly drew the scene, capturing the spirit of that moment before the darkness took over his vision. He showed the sketch to the Georgetown scholar, who now went to the area often. The scholar knew right away where it was. It was one of the highest points in the area, and the only way to get there was by climbing, which was dangerous. Thomas McAllister had written about this place many times in maps and notes. It was interesting to think that the figure could have been Thomas, Ezekiel, or another guardian whose name we don't know yet. But what was more important was what the image showed: the conscious choice to be in that impossible place, watching something that people in the lower lands couldn't see. That winter, Margaret Harrison went back to the area, this time with a photographer. They wrote down not only the places, but also the people whose lives had been changed by the mysteries of the mountains. She spoke with the growing number of people who had chosen to live near the Valley of Silence. They were drawn there for a variety of reasons, including scientific, spiritual, artistic, and even inexplicable ones. One of these people was a retired doctor from Charleston who had lost his whole family in a terrible fire. He had gone to the mountains to be alone and deal with his grief. But he found something else. On quiet nights, walking the trails under the starlight, he had begun to feel a peace that had eluded him in the noisy cities. It wasn't forgetting his loss, but acceptance and understanding that there were cycles and patterns greater than individual suffering, even though that suffering remained real and valid. Another resident was a young teacher from Boston who had read Margaret's articles and felt an irresistible compulsion to come and see the place. She couldn't rationally explain why she had left a promising career and comfortable life to live in a rustic cabin, teaching a few children from nearby villages. But every morning, waking to a view of the mist-shrouded mountains, she felt certain she was exactly where she should be. The Methodist pastor began holding regular meetings for those interested in discussing the spiritual dimensions of mountain phenomena. These meetings attracted a diverse group: traditional Christians struggling to integrate inexplicable experiences with their faith, people from other religious traditions finding parallels in their own cosmologies, and those with no specific religious affiliation, but with a deep sense that something sacred existed in those places. In March 1906, an unexpected guest showed up at one of these meetings. He was a middle-aged man who dressed simply, but carried himself with natural dignity. He asked permission to speak and then introduced himself as Samuel, someone who had been a ranger in the mountains for 15 years before eventually returning to society. His story offered a unique perspective on what it meant to accept this role, and more significantly, on the possibility of eventually leaving it. Samuel explained that becoming a guardian wasn't imprisonment or madness, but a process of deep immersion in rhythms and patterns that normally go unnoticed. During his years in the mountains, he had developed a sensitivity to subtle changes in the environment, an intuitive understanding of when and where phenomena would occur, and a sense of participating in something that connected the distant past to the unknown future. But eventually, he felt he had fulfilled his role, that it was time to return and share what he had learned in ways that others could understand. His story brought relief to many, especially to Thomas's wife. The idea that guardians could eventually choose to return meant that the door wasn't permanently closed, that Thomas might one day make that choice too. Samuel visited her privately after the meeting, talking at length about Thomas, whom he had known during his years as a guardian. He assured her that Thomas was genuinely at peace, that he had found deep purpose in his role, but that he also held on to the love and memory of those he had left behind. Spring brought administrative changes to the region. A new sheriff took office in Wise County, a younger man with progressive ideas about development and modernization. He saw the stories about the Silent Valley as obstacles to progress, superstitions that kept the region stuck in the past. He began to push for more aggressive mapping expeditions, for the opening of roads that would facilitate access to remote areas, for development that would bring economic prosperity. This approach generated immediate tension with established residents who saw value in preserving the mysteries and respecting traditional boundaries. A division formed in the community between those who supported progress and those who advocated preservation. The Georgetown scholar attempted to mediate, arguing that careful development could coexist with respect for the region's unique aspects, but encountered resistance from both sides. It was during this period of escalating tension that an event occurred that would dramatically change the course of events. The new sheriff gave permission for a group of men who didn't know or care about local customs to go into the Silent Valley to map it out. Their goal was to make it less mysterious. They carried modern equipment, including precise measuring instruments and improved photographic cameras, determined to prove that there was nothing extraordinary there besides unusual geography. The trip was gone for 3 whole days. When they finally emerged, 2 of the 5 members had to be carried in a state of deep shock, unable to speak coherently. The other 3 were clearly shaken and said they would never go back to that area. Their tools had been broken for no reason, and the pictures they took were just blurry and distorted. Their measuring tools had recorded impossible data before they stopped working altogether. The incident with the mapping expedition sent shockwaves through the mountains, sparking new discussions about how far people should be allowed to explore and how to respect places that clearly had different rules. The 2 men who had gone into shock were sent to a hospital in Roanoke, where they stayed for weeks under medical observation. Doctors could find no physical cause for their condition, diagnosing it simply as severe nervous breakdown caused by unspecified traumatic experience. The 3 remaining members of the expedition, after regaining some composure, provided fragmented and often contradictory accounts of what had happened. Everyone agreed that they had felt very lost after entering a certain part of the Valley of Silence. The sun seemed to be in strange places in the sky, compasses spun all the time, and sounds came from places that didn't make sense. One of them swore that they had been walking in a straight line for hours and ended up back where they started. Another person said they saw buildings that shouldn't be there, stone structures that came and went depending on the angle of view. The most disturbing story came from the leader of the expedition. He was an experienced engineer from Baltimore who had worked on projects in rough terrain all over the eastern United States. He said that he saw people watching them from a distance, but they never got closer. They were always on the edge of their vision. When they tried to get closer to these people, they just weren't there anymore. On the second night, when they camped in a clearing that looked safe, he woke up to find all of his tools neatly arranged in a circle around the campfire. The symbols they had seen carved into trees were now drawn in the dirt around their tents. The new sheriff's view of the Silent Valley changed completely after the event. He went to see each of the expedition's survivors in person and listened very carefully to what they had to say. Then, in April 1906, at a public meeting in Wise's main hall, he said something that shocked everyone. He said he had been arrogant in his approach and had not given enough thought to something that clearly deserved respect. He also said that there would be no more official trips to that area without first talking to local residents and people who knew the area better. The community felt better after this change of heart, but it also raised new questions about what to do next. What should be done with the Valley of Silence if it shouldn't be explored or developed? How to keep both the area and the people who might accidentally put themselves in danger by going into it safe. The Georgetown scholar suggested making something new at the time, a preservation zone. This would be an area that would be officially recognized as having special significance and where access would be controlled, not by banning people from entering, but by teaching them and showing them respect. There was a lot of debate about the proposal. Some thought it made sense, as a way to respect both the unknown and public safety. Some people said that any kind of official regulation would not be enough to deal with something that went beyond what the government usually understands. Some people were also worried that making the area more official would draw even more unwanted attention from people looking for sensationalism or ways to make money. While these arguments went on, Margaret Harrison was writing a long book about her time in the area and the research she did there. She had spent more than a year gathering stories, looking through documents and trying to put together a story that would do justice to how complicated what she was writing about was. Her job was to tell the truth about the facts in a way that was both honest and respectful, without making fun of real experiences or blowing things out of proportion for dramatic effect. In 1907, the result would be published, and it would become an important source of information for anyone who was curious about the mysteries of the Appalachians. Robert Chen, the painter, had finished a big series of paintings of the mountains in different seasons and lighting. His paintings had a quality that made people feel like they could almost see what was beyond the surface. People were very impressed when he showed these works in a gallery in Richmond. Some people said they were very moved by the pictures, and some said they had strong emotional reactions after thinking about them for a long time. A New York art critic wrote a very thoughtful review in which he said that Chen's paintings acted as portals, or windows, into understanding experiences that are hard to put into words. He said that art might be a better way to talk about certain truths about places like the Valley of Silence because purely scientific or journalistic methods have their own problems when they come across things that are on the edge of what can be measured or expressed in a normal way. In the summer of 1906, Samuel, the guardian who had returned to society, started offering something new: guided tours for people who really wanted to learn about the mountains in a respectful way. These were not trips of shallow curiosity. They were well-planned trips for people who were emotionally and spiritually ready. Samuel took small groups of people, never more than 3 at a time, to places where the phenomena were easiest to see and hear. He taught them how to be present in ways that made it easier to see things in a deeper way. The people who went on these trips came back changed in small but important ways. They didn't say they had seen miracles or had big revelations, but they did talk about how their views had changed and how they had reconnected with parts of life that modern life tends to hide. One participant, a university history professor, said that the experience was like being in direct contact with deep time. She could feel the presence of all the generations that had walked those paths before her, and somehow all the generations that would come after. Thomas's wife became a key person in this new group of people who were interested in the mysteries of the mountains. Her house in Abington became an unofficial meeting place where people could share stories and newcomers could learn from those who had lived in the area for a longer time. She wrote letters to people all over the country who had been moved by the stories, building a network of connections that went beyond the Appalachian region. She often thought about what sacrifice and purpose meant in her letters. She had come to see Thomas's choice not as a way to get out of his responsibilities or escape reality, but as a response to a calling that some people get, a call to a role that serves a greater purpose, even when that purpose is still unclear to those on the outside. She said that the guardians were like monks living in faraway monasteries, artists who are obsessed with visions they need to share, or anyone who chooses a path that others don't understand, but that they absolutely need to take. In the fall, a famous anthropologist named Franz Boas came to visit. He was from Germany and had studied cultures on every continent. He had developed theories about places of power, which are places that different cultures around the world thought had special properties. He had come to the Valley of Silence for a specific reason, to see if the strange things that happened there were similar to things that happened in other parts of the world. Boas spent 3 months in the area, doing a lot of interviews, looking at documents, going on guided tours with Samuel, and making his own careful observations. His conclusions, while articulated with requisite scholarly prudence, were groundbreaking for the era. He contended that specific locales globally exhibit a convergence of geological, magnetic, and potentially other yet-to-be-identified factors, resulting in conditions conducive to altered perceptual experiences. These experiences, rather than being pathological or illusory, may signify authentic human abilities that remain dormant in the majority of individuals and contexts. Boas controversially proposed that some individuals may possess an inherent sensitivity to specific conditions, asserting that the guardian tradition serves as a means of institutionalizing ancestral wisdom regarding effective interactions with these environments. He likened the Appalachian guardians to adherents of diverse spiritual traditions globally, who undertook analogous functions of mediating between human communities and facets of reality that typically elude perception. His ideas caused a lot of arguments in the academic world. Some coworkers said he was giving up scientific rigor for mysticism, while others said he was just being honest about what we don't know and making it easier for future research. No matter how well his work was received in the academic world, it gave the Appalachian phenomena new legitimacy, turning them from mere stories from the American frontier into serious topics of conversation. As 1906 came to a close, there was a strong feeling that something had changed in the relationship between the region and its mysteries. What started as a case of one person going missing had grown into a group investigation of questions about consciousness, perception, purpose, and the limits of what we think is real or possible. Thomas McAllister stayed in the mountains, but his absence had become a different kind of presence, a force for change that would have effects for decades to come. In the years that followed, that part of the Appalachian Mountains changed in deep but quiet ways. The Valley of Silence stayed the same, even as modernization quickly changed other parts of the country. The people who lived nearby learned to accept the mystery as a part of who they were, just like the mountains that surrounded them. Thomas McAllister never went back to normal life. His wife lived in that house in Abington for the rest of her life, keeping a silent vigil and never doubting his choice or regretting the path their lives had taken. She sometimes got signs that he was still alive in the mountains. Little things left in certain places, messages sent through people like Ezekiel and Samuel, and proof that he was still doing whatever he had found to do in those deep mountains. People in the area told stories about the guardians that became part of the local folklore. Each story kept some of the truth while adding new layers of meaning and interpretation. Kids heard stories about the surveyor who became a sentinel, the symbols on the rocks, and the lights that danced in the valleys on some nights. When they grew up, some of these young people felt the same strange pull, a magnetic attraction to faraway places where the lines between worlds seemed to be the thinnest. The Georgetown scholar eventually wrote a long, detailed academic book that covered everything he had learned about the area. His book became a must-read for anyone who wanted to understand how certain places could have a big impact on people's minds. It was a key text for people who were interested in things that were hard to put into categories. He never said he had all the answers. He just said he had asked the right questions and written down what he saw honestly. For the rest of her career, Margaret Harrison wrote about mysteries and things that couldn't be explained, but she always went back to the Appalachians as a point of reference. She used them as an example of how being humble in the face of the unknown could be more useful than being sure too soon. Her words motivated generations of investigators to treat mysteries with respect rather than arrogant doubt, and to understand that not everything that is real can be easily measured or explained. Robert Chen's paintings ended up in important collections, where they kept something that words alone couldn't. People who had never been to the Appalachian Mountains looked at his works and felt echoes of what the locals had said. It was as if the images carried an impression of the places they showed, with pieces of their essence being transferred to the canvas through the artist's careful gaze. The world around those mountains changed a lot over the years. New ways of living took the place of old ones as technology got better and cities grew. But the Valley of Silence remained relatively unchanged, protected both by its rugged geography and by a tacit agreement among those who knew its special nature. For some, it was a place to visit, while for others, it was a place to stay away from. But everyone knew that the normal rules didn't always apply there. Some people say that even today, on certain clear nights when the conditions are just right, you can see lone figures on the highest peaks, silent sentinels watching something that most people can't see. No one knows for sure if Thomas McAllister is one of them, or if he still walks those trails after all these years. But the chance is still there, whispered about in the dark and kept alive in stories that won't go away. We know for sure that some places have secrets that can't be easily explained, and that there are mysteries that don't want to be solved because maybe they shouldn't be. The story of Thomas McAllister shows us that reality is bigger and stranger than we usually think. There are places on the edge of our understanding where the extraordinary becomes ordinary and the impossible just is. The Appalachian Mountains keep rising against the horizon. Their slopes are covered in old forests, and their valleys hide memories of all the people who have walked their trails over the years. And maybe sentinels still keep watch somewhere between these peaks, doing the jobs they have chosen to do as guardians of borders that don't show up on any map, but are as real as stone and earth. This is the story of Thomas McAllister, or at least the version we know, The whole truth is still up there, waiting for someone brave or cold enough to look for it. They know that when they find it, they might choose to stay and become part of the mystery they came to investigate. Please leave a comment if you like this trip through the mountains' mysteries. Subscribe to the channel for more scary and dark stories that make us question what we know about the world. Until the next time we go somewhere new.